For most of history, power was heavy. It moved in the form of gold. It was locked in vaults, carried across oceans, and guarded by soldiers. Empires rose on what they could physically control. If you had more gold, you had more power. If you lost it, your strength disappeared with it. That was the rule. Simple, physical, unforgiving. But then something strange began to happen. Nations discovered a different kind of power, not mined from the earth, not captured in war, but created, printed, issued, declared into existence. At first, it seemed like a shortcut, a convenience, a tool to make trade easier. But it wasn't just that, because once power no longer depended on physical gold, it was no longer limited by it either. And that changed everything. The balance between nations began to shift. Quietly, gradually, irreversibly. So how did pieces of paper replace gold and end up reshaping global power itself? To understand that, we need to go back to a world where money had weight. Paper money did more than make trade easier. It quietly changed what power actually meant. Before this shift, wealth was something you could touch. Gold, silver, land. If it wasn't physical, it didn't count. Every empire lived within those limits. You could only spend what you had, and what you had was always finite. But paper money introduced a new idea. Value no longer had to sit in a vault. It could exist as a promise backed by trust, a promise issued by a state, a promise people agreed to believe in, and that changed the rules. Because now, power was no longer tied only to resources. It was tied to systems, to confidence, to control over money itself. Some nations saw this early. They realized that if you could issue money, you could move faster than your rivals. You could fund wars before you had the gold, build infrastructure without waiting for resources, expand influence beyond your physical limits. In short, you could act ahead of reality. And those who mastered this didn't just grow stronger. They began to outpace everyone else. But this new power came with a hidden risk. Because if money was built on belief, what happened when that belief started to crack? Before paper money, every economy had a hard limit. It was defined by what it could physically hold. Gold and silver were not just money. They were the ceiling of ambition. If you wanted to spend more, you needed more metal. And that was the problem. Because economies were growing faster than their money supply. Trade routes were expanding across continents. Markets were becoming more connected, more complex, more demanding. But the money system stayed slow, rigid, heavy, difficult to move. Transporting gold was expensive and dangerous. Ships sank. Caravans were robbed. Entire fortunes could vanish on a single journey. And even when it arrived, it wasn't enough. Empires began to feel the strain. They had opportunities in front of them, new trade routes, new wars, new expansions. But they couldn't act fast enough, because every decision had to wait for metal. This created a dangerous mismatch. A fast-moving world, trapped inside a slow-moving system. At first, governments tried to stretch what they had. They debased coins, reduced purity, quietly diluted value to keep spending. But that only delayed the problem. The deeper issue remained. The world was outgrowing gold. And unless something changed, growth itself would begin to stall. That pressure between expanding economies and limited money set the stage for a radical shift. A new idea was about to emerge. Transporting wealth was never simple. It was slow, risky, inefficient. Gold had weight, and that weight came with consequences. To move it, you needed ships, guards, and time. A single transfer could take weeks, sometimes months, and every mile carried risk. Storms could sink it. Thieves could steal it. War could intercept it. Even the strongest empires faced the same bottleneck. No matter how much wealth they had, they couldn't move it fast enough. And that delay created a deeper problem. Because power depends on timing. Armies needed to be paid on time. Supplies had to arrive before battles began. Opportunities in trade had narrow windows. Missed a moment, and the advantage was gone. In a world that was starting to move faster, this limitation became dangerous. It meant that even rich empires could act poor, not because they lacked resources, but because they couldn't deploy them when it mattered. and that exposed a weakness. Speed was becoming power, and gold was slowing everything down. So the question began to shift. Not how much wealth do you have, but how quickly can you use it? That question would change everything, because the solution wasn't more gold. It was a new way to move value itself. And once that idea appeared, the entire system began to transform. The solution, when it came, seemed almost too simple. Don't move the gold. Represent it. Instead of carrying metal across long distances, governments began issuing paper claims, small notes that stood in place of real wealth. At first, these were just promises, a piece of paper you could exchange for gold later. Nothing more. But that was enough, because people started accepting the paper itself, not because it had value, but because they trusted it did. And that trust changed everything. Now wealth could move instantly. No ships, no guards, no delays, just a note passed from one hand to another. Governments quickly saw the potential. If paper could represent gold, it didn't always need to be backed by it in full. They could issue more notes than they held in reserves, expand spending without expanding metal. And just like that, a new kind of power emerged, not based on what you had, but on what people believed you had. This was different, subtle, invisible, flexible. Power was no longer stored in vaults. It lived in confidence. And for the first time in history, control over money meant control over perception itself. But once this system began to grow, it didn't stay small for long. When early states began issuing paper currency, the impact was immediate and impossible to ignore. Suddenly, governments could act faster than ever before. They no longer had to wait for gold to arrive. They could create money when they needed it. Armies were funded in weeks instead of months. Wars could be sustained longer than reserves would normally allow. Power became more flexible, more responsive. Trade expanded too. Merchants no longer needed to carry heavy metal across borders. Paper moved easily, quickly, safely. Markets grew larger. Distances felt smaller. Entire economies began to stretch beyond their natural limits. And for a time, it felt like a breakthrough. Growth accelerated. States expanded their reach. Opportunities multiplied. But beneath that progress, something fragile was forming, because this system depended on one thing above all else: trust. Trust that the paper held value. Trust that governments wouldn't issue too much. Trust that promises would be kept. And as long as that trust held, the system worked. But the moment it didn't, everything could unravel. Because unlike gold, paper had no inherent limit. And that raised a dangerous question. If power could be created from belief, what happens when belief itself begins to break? As the idea spread, more nations began to adopt it, each one adjusting the system, refining it, expanding it. Paper money was no longer an experiment. It was becoming standard. Banks started to rise at the center of this new world, not just as vaults for gold, but as creators of money itself. They issued loans, extended credit, turned promises into purchasing power. And with every loan, the system grew. Money was no longer just printed by states. It was multiplied through banks, expanded through networks of trust and debt. This changed the scale completely. Financial systems became more complex, more connected, more powerful than anything before. A single decision in one country could ripple across continents. What began as a simple convenience, a way to avoid carrying gold, had become something much bigger. It became the foundation of modern economic power. Nations were no longer competing only with resources. They were competing with financial systems. Who could create more liquidity? Who could sustain more credit? Who could manage belief at scale? Because now, power didn't just depend on what you owned, but on how well you could expand it. And that raised a deeper question. If the system keeps growing, where are its limits? Today, money isn't even paper anymore. It's digital, invisible, instant. Numbers move across screens in milliseconds. Billions transferred without a single physical object changing hands. But beneath all this technology, the core idea hasn't changed. Money is still built on belief. The same principle that began with paper notes now powers the entire global system. When you see a number in a bank account, You don't question it. You trust it. And that trust is everything. Because without it, the system stops. Banks would freeze. Markets would collapse. Currencies would lose meaning overnight. So nations don't just manage economies anymore. They manage confidence. They protect trust, stabilize expectations, control the perception of value. Because in this world, belief is power. The countries that control strong, trusted currencies don't just influence trade. They shape global reality itself. And that leads to a final realization. Money was never just about wealth. It was about control. Control over belief. Control over the future. Paper money didn't just change economies. It changed people. It reshaped how we think about value, how we take risks, how far we are willing to go. When wealth was physical, decisions were cautious, limited by what you could see and hold. Ambition had boundaries. But paper changed that. It made expansion easier, risk more acceptable, growth feel almost limitless. Because now, wealth could be created ahead of reality, spent before it truly existed. And that blurred something important. The line between what is real and what is believed to be real. Markets began to move on expectations. Nations rose on confidence. Crises emerged when belief collapsed. In this system, perception became power, not as an illusion, but as a force that shapes real outcomes. And that is the legacy of paper money. It didn't just replace gold. It replaced certainty with something far more powerful and far more fragile. Belief. What began as a simple solution to a logistical problem became something far greater. Paper money was never just about convenience. It was about transformation, a way to move value faster, then a way to create it, and eventually a way to control it. Because once money was no longer tied to metal, it became tied to trust. And trust, in the hands of a nation, became a powerful tool, almost like a weapon, not one that destroys, but one that shapes outcomes. Those who understood this early gained an advantage. No army could match. They could fund wars longer, stabilize crises faster, expand influence without borders, and most importantly, they could shape belief itself. Because in the end, power was no longer decided by what nations had. It was decided by what they could make others believe they had. And that is the world we still live in. A system where confidence creates reality, and where belief, more than anything else, decides who holds power. If you want to understand how invisible systems shape real-world power, you're in the right place. Because the biggest forces in history are rarely visible. They don't march in armies or sit in vaults. They operate quietly, shaping decisions, economies, and entire nations. Money is one of them, but it's not the only one. Behind every major shift in history, there are systems most people never notice. And once you see them, you start to understand how the world really works. So if you're curious about the hidden economics behind power, subscribe and stay with us. Because the deeper you look, the more you realize the real forces shaping the world are the ones you can't see.